of Thermodynamics and Combustion Theory at the University of Leeds. He is also the director of Truth in Science, which promotes creationism and intelligent design, which I put down on my notes, God. But he's also known as Brother Andy. So should we welcome Professor Andy Mcintosh this morning. Brother Andy. Thank you, bro.
Thank you. Just need to put this on. Yeah, that's fine. No, I need it. Yeah. Yes, I may need it. I've got a cup. Good. Can I just mention something before I read the scriptures and speak to you? First of all, I want to thank you on behalf of Christian Answer for letting us use this very building. We only had 2 men actually staying. Last year it was about 6. The year before when I did it, it was COVID times, but last time before that was about 8 or 9. So we're really needing far more young people. Sorry, just realized. Really need far more young people on our Christian Answer team. So if you want to join us next year, James will tell you more about it because he's seen us at least once on the middle of Cambridge and Sydney Street, Market Street, preaching on the open air. And that's what we were doing last week. We call it Christian Answer. And the males stay here and the girls and the ladies stay at Roseford Chapel, just about, about 7 minutes, 8 minutes away off Histon Road. So we had a very good time, and thank you so much, James and Andy and others here who've let us use it. We've used it for about 10 years or so, so we're very grateful for it. The other thing I want to say, which is another notice, I did ask permission about this, is that right at the end of August and the first day of September, so 31st of August, which is Thursday, and Friday, the 1st of September, there is a summer school which Truth in Science is running, and that's another one of my hats that I wear. I work with Christian Answer, and I speak on creation, but I also am a co-director to this organisation, Truth in Science, which you may have heard of. And it's a conference at Yarnfield Park in Staffordshire, and it's for 2 days, how to cope with evolution and anti-Christian thinking in sixth form and university courses, plus how to stand in the Christian student community. We've got a whole series of speakers. Peter J. Williams from this very city, who's director of Tyndale House. He's speaking. He's doing the plenary opening talk on the reliability of the New Testament. We've got talks like ethical dilemmas in medicine, which is becoming a big issue today with all the transgender stuff which is coming in. And how do we stand against critical race theory, what it is and is it biblical? The state of the nation, how we are to respond. Plus talks on creation, how old is the earth and how can we know? And then how life began according to evolution and how it began according to creation, which one's right. And there's many other talks, both on creation, evolution issues, as you could tell, but also on how to stand in this age where lots of evil stuff is being pushed to our young people, as was prayed by one of the people here concerning the family. So we do need to stand. So if you're 16 to 24, then this is for you. If you're older, you can still come, but you realize that it's geared for young people coming into the sixth form, going into university or at university. So if you know of others who would like to come, there's a lot of leaflets at the back. Please take them. £65 for 2 days, where you've got about 10 talks. It's really packed full of stuff. And please consider coming. Okay, please turn with me to Colossians chapter 1. I'm going to read it to you, just some verses from it. Verse 12, Colossians chapter 1. Giving thanks unto the Father, which has made us meet to be partakers of the inheritance of the saints in light, who has delivered us from the power of darkness and translated us into the kingdom of his dear Son, in whom we have redemption through his blood, even the forgiveness of sins. Wonderful verse that one is. Who, speaking of Christ, is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of every creature, for by him were all things created, that are in heaven, that are in earth, visible and invisible, whether there be thrones, dominions, or principalities or powers. All things were created by him and for him, and he is before all things, and by him all things consist. He is the head of the body, the church, who is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in all things he might have the preeminence. For it pleased the Father that in him should all fullness dwell, and having made peace through the blood of his cross, by him to reconcile all things unto himself. By him I say, whether they be things in earth or things in heaven. And that's why I read it, because it actually mentions things in heaven. It doesn't specifically say stars, but it's evident that Paul is thinking of the whole of the universe, basically, is for his glory. Is there something wrong, Chelsea? I see. That was too near. All right. Beg your pardon. I thought you would need to get closer before. There we go. All right. So the heavens declare the glory of God, what the Bible says about stars and space. Now, you need to realize that, of course, the days of creation are the Hebrew word yom, and we are often confused in our minds because of all the stuff coming in from the media. But actually, we need to keep it in a very straightforward way. God made light on the first day. Actually, my conviction, I can't quite prove this, so I'll be utterly honest, I can't quite prove it, but I suspect that God made electromagnetic radiation on the first day. Get that? He made the very thing which is absolutely essential for everything, the connection of electricity with magnetism. And of course, the electromagnetic spectrum, if you're a physicist, isn't just red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. It's infrared and all the stuff below infrared. It is all the stuff above ultraviolet, including X-rays and gamma rays and all the rest of it, which I won't give you a whole lecture on that. But I'm from that background, so it's hardly surprising that I'm thinking that. Then I'm not going to go through all the days, but these days, according to the Bible, when you read it in a very straightforward way, are just ordinary 24-hour days. 2 points to note. Genesis is historical literature. Poetry sometimes mentions creation. I won't read it for you, or won't put it up on the screen, but I will just read it to you. By the word of the Lord were the heavens made, Psalm 33, verse 6, and all the host of them by the breath of his mouth. That's a repetition, okay? But saying it one way, saying it a different way. That's the mark of Hebrew poetry. It's parallelism. But there's not a hint of that in Genesis 1. It's just a straightforward narrative. This happened, that happened, evening and morning, day number 1. Next thing happens, he creates the heaven. He splits basically the waters above from the waters below, and he creates space. I'm going to come to that in a moment. But then it says evening and morning, day number 2, and so on. The word used can be meaning the daylight part of a day, or it can mean an indefinite period, like the day of the Lord. This word yom is used very much like our English word day, so it has the similar usage. But the context always makes it plain. If you want a long, definite period of time, it would be olam, which is not used at all. So the context of Genesis 1 demands a literal 24-hour day. There is absolutely no doubt about it, because it says evening and morning, day number 1. evening and morning, day 2, and so on. In fact, it's not number 1 on the first day, it's evening and morning, day 1. It's actually, the actual Hebrew is a definition, and it's the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th and 5th days, which are using a slightly different construction. I won't put all the detail of that, but if you want to ask me afterwards, there is actually a difference between day 1 and the rest of the days. It's actually defining the word day, and it's saying, really, this is what a day is, evening and morning. So you couldn't have it more strongly than God is saying, these are ordinary days. Where you get a repetition of evening and morning, and where you get numbers attached to the days, it always means in the Hebrew an ordinary day. For instance, there is a place in 1 Samuel 17, in the third line on this screen, where Goliath is challenging the armies of Israel to a fight. And it says that he stood there evening and morning for 40 million years. No. He stood there evening and morning for 40 weeks. No, it doesn't even mean that. It means ordinary days. It was nearly 6 weeks that Goliath stood there, got there in the morning, got there in the evening, challenging the armies of Israel to give him a person to fight. And of course, King David takes his head off, and that's the end of Goliath. So we all know the story. One very important point is the Sabbath command of Exodus 20, verse 11. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested the 7th day. The Sabbath command must be dealing with 7 ordinary days to make sense. Now, I'm not saying people have different views as to whether they call Sunday the day-to-day, the new Sabbath for the church. Not everybody has the same view on that, and I'm not touching that. I'm just saying that the Jews certainly knew that their Saturday, the 7th day, was a Sabbath. Why? Because God had commanded it. Therefore, it makes it abundantly plain from the context that God was thinking of 6 ordinary days, and the 7th you're not to work. It's the Sabbath. That's what the Jews had to keep, right? Even if you don't accept that it's a Sabbath today, and people have different views, that's irrelevant. The Jews certainly knew that it was a Sabbath on the Saturday. So people have a problem because we're now coming to the stars. So what of the light before the sun and the moon? All made on the 4th day. What on earth are you going to say to that, Andy? How on earth can you have light made before the sun, moon, and stars? Is that a problem? No. Why should it be a problem? Why do people make such a problem when our God is great? He doesn't need the sun, like we've got it today, to shine. Yes, it's at God's behest that it shines, a bit more warmly than it was last month. But, why should we limit God? The Lord doesn't need the sun to produce light. Go to Matthew 17, Mount of Transfiguration. What was Jesus shining with on the Mount of Transfiguration? It must have been God's glory. It was the Shekinah glory coming out from the Lord, the second person of the Trinity. You don't need the sun for the Lord to shine. And specifically, it says in Revelation 21, verse 23, that there is no need of the sun in that place, which is the new heavens and the new earth. And it says we don't need the sun because why? Because it specifically says that the Lamb is the light of that place, and the Lamb is referring to Christ. So although I can't actually prove it 100%, the implication is that it could well have been the Lord Jesus Christ shining on a rotating globe of water. I can't quite prove it. God could have made a localized light source. It's up to him how he did it. He will perhaps do us a video replay when we get to heaven. But frankly, I think we'll be so overawed with the presence of Christ, we won't need it. It won't be a problem, will it? But nevertheless, God used either his own light or else he made a local created light, which then shone on a rotating globe of water. And it was only on the 4th day that then all the stars began to shine. Now, I know that raises big issues. We've got people down the road, and not here in Cambridge, people in my own University of Leeds who say, that's totally off the wall, Andy. You are just totally unscientific. Hold your horses. Let's have a look. Interestingly, not long ago, well, it is long ago now, it's over 50 years, but it doesn't seem long ago because I remember this. You don't remember it, James, because don't think you were even here. But this was amazing when it happened. Certainly Chelsea wouldn't have heard it, but there we go. That was utterly staggering when that happened. Some of you can perhaps remember it, where we had this voice from space reading Genesis 1. It was utterly, it had us spellbound as a nation. Today you'd say, how dare they? But they did. And NASA actually did have a little bit of a surprise, but they didn't fire them. They would fire them today if they did that. But how well said James Irwin, who died in 91, the 8th person on the moon, when he said, God walking on the earth is more important than man walking on the moon. But it really was dramatic when the next year after 68, of course, that was 68 that we heard them speaking as they gone round the moon. The next year, they actually landed on it. What a contrast with this from Stephen Hawking, who was at this very university and died in, whenever it was, about 6-7 years ago. The human race, he said, is just a chemical scum on a moderate-sized planet orbiting around a very average star in the outer suburb of 100 billion galaxies. We're so insignificant, I can't believe that the whole universe exists for our benefit. How sad. Now I want to show you that actually this is really not unscientific, what we are proposing. Consider for a moment the amazing planets, including our own Earth. I won't go through them all, but just to give you a sense of the greatness of what God has done. Our Earth is unique. It's not too close, it's not too far away from the sun. It's just the right temperature to support life. It's got a wonderful atmosphere, which is seen here. And the moon, of course, which I haven't time to go into, but I could do a whole, a good 10 minutes or so on the moon. But the moon is just the right size. It's quite large, actually, as a satellite. Large enough to actually pull on the oceans to keep them well circulating. And, of course, it also throws into, obviously, into the tides and everything. But the balance of water and oxygen and the atmosphere is just so exactly right for the Earth. And if the Earth had been smaller like this, like Mars, right? Mars, it would seem, has lost its atmosphere. And Mars did have water. Actually, Mars has got a bit of an atmosphere left because they've been able to fly a helicopter there because it's got a lot of carbon dioxide, but nowhere near the amount of pressure of its atmosphere like here. So the Earth is just the right size also for pulling on an atmosphere and keeping it. And as I mentioned, the moon's gravitational pull is absolutely essential for the tides on Earth. Just consider for a moment Mars, because there's some incredible pictures come back from Mars. I love it when they produce all these pictures, but frankly, I know it's an awful lot of money, but it's staggering what they found. Because what these actually show from the actual endurance, which has been going around taking photographs, is that Mars seems to have got layers of sediments, which indicates, and everybody's saying it, that there used to be water there. And frankly, it's quite amazing because I said this is called the Endurance Crater, but Curiosity showed some staggering outcrops. And Curiosity has been taking pictures. I'm going to go through these quite quickly. But look at this one. This one is about 1.5 meters wide, and it's showing you all the details, just like you might see in slabs of slate, either in North Wales or down in Devon. You would see, on the coast of our amazing islands here in Britain, you see evidence of sedimentary layering. So it's clear that Mars did have a lot of water at one time. And yet when we're told that we can't have a lot of water to have a flood here, oh, no. But they say there was clearly something of a flood on Mars, but they don't see that the evidence is just the same on Earth, that we also had a flood and we have kept our water, whereas Mars has not. If you look at Jupiter, amazing, it's got incredible moons. I think the number has got up to somewhere like 40 in all, but the inner moons, what's called the Galilean moons, are frankly extraordinary. And Io, the one which was on the left there, Io, if you look at it more closely, is the most geologically active object in the solar system. Volcanoes, some of them taller than Everest, spewing out sulfur and sulfur dioxide up to 300 miles above the surface. The activity of the moons of Jupiter immediately tells you these are not millions of years old. That's why I'm showing you this. Saturn, it's even more staggering. Saturn has, I can't remember the number of moons. It's in my book, but I can't remember the number. It's way beyond Jupiter's. And some of them are huge, like Titan, right? But it's still obviously nowhere near the size of Saturn, which is a very large planet. And Saturn's biggest moon, Titan, has an atmosphere. And Cassini went actually close to Enceladus, which is the one on the left of this picture, right? So we're going to jump there. And again, jets of water vapor and ice coming out of Enceladus, strongly suggesting that that moon is not old, it's young, right? There are big issues which are indicating to us that the solar system is not as old as people make out. Now, I'm going to move on because I want to actually cover some pretty important areas here. The stars and the heavenly bodies were made on the fourth day. We just dealt with that in Creation Week, right? Genesis 1. Psalm 19, which I could have also read, but couldn't read everything. We could have read Genesis 1 as well. But Psalm 19 says, of course, the heavens declare the glory of God. Perhaps I will just turn you to it because it is a majestic psalm. But if you notice, let me just tell you this, in case you haven't realized it, those of you who've been believers for many years, you know this. But Psalm 19 is about two things. It's about the stars, but it's also the second part about what? What's the second part before you turn to it and read it? Could you speak up? Yes, it's about the firmament, which is the stretching of the heavens, which I'm coming to. But the second half of the psalm, what's it about? The law of God. So it's about the scriptures, essentially, the Old Testament scriptures. So Psalm 19 is saying, the heavens declare the glory of God, day unto day utters speech, and night unto night shows knowledge. And then it goes on to say about the sun, it's like a bridegroom coming out of his chamber and rejoices as a strong man running a race. His going forth is from the end of heaven, and his circuit unto the ends of it. Verse 6. There is nothing hid from the heat thereof, you bet, when it's a day like this. But then it goes on to say, in the second half, the law of the Lord is perfect, converting the soul. So the implication is that the creation, great as it is, does not of itself convert the soul. We need to be careful that we don't worship the creation. The nation which worshipped the sun most of all, of course, was Egypt, because Egypt's so hot, so much dependent on the sun, and of course the River Nile. and it was worshipping the creation, Aten, they called the sun. So we need to be careful. Having said that it's glorious, we mustn't start worshipping it, as some people, of course, do. Psalm 8, verse 3 says, the stars are the work of his fingers. And Isaiah 59 says, he saw that there was no man and wondered that there was no intercessor, because now I'm just contrasting that his arm brings salvation. Creation of the stars is the work of his fingers, right? In other words, it was dead easy for God to make all... How many stars are there? Have you counted them? We're coming to that. You might run out of fingers to count them. In fact, you'll run out of many, 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 many hands. There's so many. But it was dead easy for God to count the stars. We're coming to that. But he had to bare his right arm in order to bring salvation. He had to really go down to the depths to save us. Never forget then, in this whole subject of astronomy, not to forget the importance of God's Bible, his law, and it's not thinking so much of the Ten Commandments here. It's talking about his word. His word converts us, right? And also let us not forget that salvation is far greater than the work of making the stars. Now let's begin to start counting the stars. Well, first of all, notice that Psalm 147 verse 4 says, every star is named. Did you know that? God knows the name of every single star. It says that in Psalm 147 verse 4. He tells the number of the stars. He calls them all by their names. He doesn't just count them, he can actually call them names. And exactly the same thing is said in Isaiah 40, verse 26. That is amazing, isn't it? Well, in order to begin to get an idea as to the number of stars, I now need to just define something in order for us to begin to get a sense of the wonder of what God has done. I need a ruler in order to measure distance. And because we're beginning to get into very large distances, much larger than distances on the earth, much larger than the distance even from the earth to the moon, much larger even than a distance going from the earth to the sun, I'm going to need a different ruler, right? It's no use using a 6-inch ruler for this, is it? You're going to run out of rulers, aren't you? So you use a different ruler. And what the ruler we use is how far light travels in a particular amount of time. So, for instance, in 1 second, light travels 300,000 kilometers, approximately 7 times around the world, right? That's pretty fast. Well, it is. It's a very fast speed. So a light second is what I've just said, 300,000 kilometers. A light minute is 18 million kilometers. The distance to the sun is about 150 million kilometers. So the sun is approximately 8.5, just under, light minutes away. So it's not a measure of time, it's a measure of distance. Do you get it? But we're going to need light years. What's the distance that a light year travels? Well, that's actually 525,600,000 light minutes, if you work it out. So a light year is actually 10 trillion kilometers. You now have to start putting 10 raised to a power. So it's nearly 10 times 10 raised to multiplied by itself 12 times. Oh dear, this is getting complicated, you say. Well, just forget what a light year is. Just know that it's big, okay? Just keep that in your mind. It's big, right? Now we're going to start measuring things in light hours and light years. And just so that you get some idea, the time taken for light to go right across the solar system is about 10 hours. So that gives you a sense of how big our solar system is. Now let's actually move on, because we're going to get even greater distances. Let's consider our own Milky Way galaxy. This is the Milky Way viewed from Earth. We can actually see it going overhead. When I went down the Grand Canyon, way down, that was about 2009. So, well, that's going 14 years ago. It doesn't seem like 14 years ago, but it was. Juliet and I went down the Grand Canyon, and we were going on a trip, and I was doing some teaching. So I was got that free passage for Juliet as well. And wow, was it grand. We slept, but I didn't sleep because we didn't have tents or anything. We just slept out in the open on, the Americans call them cots, but I just call them camp beds. And I was watching the stars as they went overhead, and I could see the Milky Way in all its glory going overhead, inching its way, just like Psalm 19 described. Wow, I said. But do you know how big the Milky Way is, our own galaxy? Take a deep breath and then say, wow. 100,000 light years across. That's our own galaxy. And you say, well, where is the solar system? Well, it's there, in case you want to know, right? So you are here. So the Milky Way, viewed from, Star Trek going to some other galaxy, if he was looking at, not that anybody has ever done it, but if you were to look at the Milky Way, we've worked out that it's got a series of arms, and we are near what's called the Perseus arm, but don't worry too much about the detail. You can look it up on YouTube or whatever, on Google. But you see that we are in the Milky Way galaxy, not too close, such that, we wouldn't be able to have any darkness at night because the stars would be so bright. Not so far away that it would be totally black. God has placed us in exactly the right place in the Milky Way, such that we get a sense of awe as we see the stars go overhead. Well, now we need to get a real concept of how many stars there are. So, how many stars are there? Well, just before I get to there, which is right at the bottom, let me just describe how big it is. As I said, it's 100 million times the diameter of Pluto's orbit. Well, Pluto's been downgraded and said, you're not a planet. Well, I've always brought up with Pluto as the 9th planet, but forget it. It's a dwarf planet. But it's 100,000 light years across, and it's about 100 million times the diameter of Pluto's orbit. That's the Milky Way. So how many stars are in the Milky Way? Well, people have estimated that it's about 200,000 million. That's just in our galaxy. Remember Psalm 147? God knows all the stars by name. And I'm sure he's got his mind especially on our galaxy. So let's just sort of try and get some idea as to counting the stars. I'm going to skip that slide and I'm just going to say, here's Abraham counting the stars. How many are there? Well, I've already told you actually what the answer is for our galaxy. But just for a moment, consider Abraham and the promise given to him. Tell the stars if you'd be able to number them. Abraham was told that his descendants would be so great that actually he would lose count. Look towards the heaven, tell the stars if you be able to number them. And he said unto them, so shall your seed be. So how many stars could Abraham see? Well, in the northern hemisphere, just with the naked eye, you can see about 3,000. Southern hemisphere, about the same. 6-inch telescope, you can see 30,000. Large professional telescopes, as I've said, can see about they can work out, they can't necessarily see each one of them, but they are estimating that it's about 200,000 million stars in the Milky Way. That's a lot of stars. If you were to try and count these 200,000 million stars, 200 billion, say you're going to count them at 3 per second. After 100 years, you would have counted less than 5% of the Milky Way. Okay, so let's up it. Let's count them at 3 million stars per second. I can't do that. You can't. You wouldn't get anywhere near it. Even a computer would have some difficulty. It would still take 18 and a half hours for a computer to count all the 200,000 million or 200 billion Milky Way stars. But you've been thinking to yourself, but we know there's more than the Milky Way, and you're right. Of course, if you go back to the Second World War, people thought that there was only one galaxy. And then Hubble, with his work, realized that there was clouds of stars, or clouds in the sky. Didn't quite work out what they were. And then he looked at them a bit more and realized that they were full of stars, those clouds, and that there were other galaxies. And so began the journey to discover many, many galaxies. The Milky Way is just one of billions of galaxies. How many? Well, let me do a very quick experiment with you, or suggest one. Suppose you were to get a bit of paper and you put a little dot, a little hole in it, and hold it a meter away, right? This is what you would see with the Hubble telescope, the old telescope. I'm coming to the James Webb, right? The Hubble telescope could magnify what you could see as a little dot, right, on a bit of paper, and it would magnify it out, and it would see this, right? That's what the Hubble could see. This is, the technical term is, the square is 2 arc minutes wide, just 2.5 arc minutes wide and 2.5 minutes tall. 1/10 of the angular diameter of a full moon, smaller than a 1 millimeter by 1 millimeter square on a piece of paper held 1 meter away. And you can see here loads and loads and loads of galaxies, right? This is just in this tiny little dot. You can see galaxy there, galaxy there, galaxy there, galaxy there, galaxy there, right? Anything which is looks like a flying saucer, some of them, and some of them are. There's another galaxy, and there's another one. They're all galaxies. In other words, the universe is full of galaxies. And as I've indicated, it's getting towards billions of galaxies. But the James Webb telescope has come into play recently, and they magnified things even further. And they've gone out to a record 13 billion light years out, okay? And they found yet more galaxies far bigger than they thought there should be at that distance. And indeed, they said in a paper just this year, this is the much bigger James Webb telescope. The first results from the James Webb telescope have hinted at galaxies so early and so massive that they are in tension, notice, with they should say their understanding of the formation of structure in the universe. Various explanations have been proposed that may alleviate this tension. In other words, they've got a problem. Because what they were expecting was that when they go further out, that they would just get simple, structures. But in fact, they get well-developed structures, spiral galaxies looking as though they've been there for all the time that the universe has existed, and mature galaxies. So they say, we don't understand. You bet they don't understand. Because they're starting with the wrong premise. Let me tell you something else that they found. They find that galaxies are connected. And one of the things which is quite remarkable is this picture, which is our local cluster of galaxies, right? And I've written it a bit more up here. Scientists have created the first map of a colossal superstructure of galaxies known as this term, the home of Earth's Milky Way. And that's where we are, the Milky Way. In other words, all this picture here is a picture of all the galaxies all being connected together. And that itself is 250 million light years across. So you need to know where you are. Well, you are here, right? Now we're dealing on a much larger scale, right? We're dealing with gigantic distances. And what we're saying is that the Milky Way is there. We're not talking about the solar system anymore. And it's connected with all these other galaxies. That's just one galaxy. But that's not the biggest thing of all. There are some structures which are 10 billion light years across. Now, this gets really awkward for the evolutionary ideas of the universe. The biggest supercluster is known as this one. It's called the Great Wall. It was first reported in 2013, been studied several times. It's so big that light takes 10 billion years to move across the structure. And yet the universe, in their opinion, is 13.8 billion years old. Now that raises a lot of issues because they accuse us of having a light travel problem. How can we believe that the universe is only 6,000 years? They say, when the light getting to us is obviously coming from distances of billions of light years and we can see them. I grant you, I don't know the full answer to that question, but they themselves have a big issue. Because in order to actually get some sort of equilibrium, which they argue for in the universe, then they've got to have much longer than 13.8 billion years in order to get all these bits of stars and galaxies interacting with one another, and they haven't got enough time. So what is the total number of galaxies? Well, over 2 million have been counted, but there could be as many as 100,000 million. That is 100 billion galaxies. Get that. That could be 10 raised to the 11 billion, 10 to the 11 galaxies. So the estimated number of stars, remember, we said was 2 times 10 to the 11. It's very hot, difficult to do mathematics, but you've now got to multiply 2 numbers with me, right? It's not that hard. You just add the 10s together. 10 to the 11 times 10 to the 11 is 10 to the 22, and you've got 2 in front of it. So actually, the total number of stars estimate is 2 times 10 to the 22, and that's conservative. It may be more than that. If a computer then was observing these at 3 million per second, it would take 211 million years to count all the stars. Even at 10 million per second, it would still take 63 million years for a computer to count the stars. In other words, you've got to give up. Do you think God is big? Yeah. He certainly knows what he's talking about, doesn't he? Psalm 147 says he knows all the stars by name. Now, I need to draw this not to a conclusion quite yet, but to an important climax. We have learned that the stars and the heavenly bodies were made on the 4th day. We know that Psalm 19 says they declare the glory of God. We know that Psalm 8 says that they are the work of his fingers, dead easy for him to do. But consider again that each star is named. And now consider with me what one of the gentlemen said. Psalm 19 describes the firmament. And I'm going to home in on that. It's absolutely incredible. You see, many people say that on day 2 he just made the sky, and I've had a discussion with somebody in the congregation on this. But frankly, that isn't the depth of day 2. And I'm going to show you that day 2 is the making of space. Now get a grip on this, because it's biblical. God, let's use the word expanse, because the word firmament comes from the Latin Vulgate translation, which talked about, was thinking, probably the translators were thinking of a dome, and they were thinking of a firm, we get the word firm from, and it's actually not very helpful to us. The rachia, which is the Hebrew, has no sense of dome, no sense necessarily of even solidity. It just means, I think the best word is expanse. God made the expanse. So, God made the expanse on day 2. Genesis 1 verse 6 says, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters. I'm using the word expanse. So when the Hebrew raka, I'm calling it rachia, expanse. And God called the firmament heaven, verse 8 in the AV. God called the expanse heaven. Now do you see why it's not just the sky? It obviously includes the sky or the atmosphere, which is right at the edge of the expanse. And indeed, just to expand your mind a bit more, where did Paul say he was when he had a vision of God? Third heaven, which implies that there are 2 other heavens. I can't quite prove this, but I would suggest to you that the first heaven is the sky, which the birds fly in, and the clouds and the atmosphere is. The second heaven is what I'm really referring to now, which is where the stars are. And it's huge. It's gigantic. It's so big that, the mind is blown even to think of it. But it's finite. Not what the world thinks. Once you start beginning to think like this, you begin to see that there is a totally different cosmology which is biblically based. Because it's only God who is infinite. Yes, he can make huge things, but they're never as big as he is. He is infinite and he's made a finite expanse, but it's gigantic. It's so big that from our point of view, it's infinite to all intents and purposes. But now it says the expanse, God called the expanse heaven. The word is Shemayim. And so then it says in verse 14 that God put the lights in the rachia of the Shemayim. Here is the actual scriptures where I've put Shemayim above the word heaven and I've put rachia above the authorized firmament. But I haven't used the ESV, which is maybe what you're using. It doesn't matter. I don't get hung up on versions as long as they're true to the original. I do have some issues with some which are not. You can't sort of write the English above the Hebrew, and that's what I like. ESV, you can do that. Some versions, I won't name them, you can't do that. So that's where I sit. I just find that the authorized pretty good. It's not always accurate, but in the main, it's pretty good. So now, do you see where I'm coming from here? Now, I'm talking about the expanse. Now, this is going to unlock something. Now, have you heard of John Walton? Some of you have. Now, he makes big, big statements. He tries to say that Genesis 1 is not an account of material origins, but an account of functional origins, specifically focusing on the function of the cosmos as God's temple. And that's why he goes on about function. And so he says, look, the ancient Near East is the way that we must understand Genesis, and the interpretation of Genesis 1 is according to their way of looking at the firmament, and that really what God was doing was building a cosmic temple. And it's not talking about 24 hours literally, but 24 hours maybe for Moses to receive it. It basically undermines what I've been saying, which is what the scriptures are really teaching. I would suggest to you that is wrong. We don't need the ancient Near Eastern thinking in order to understand Genesis. Genesis was written by God the Holy Spirit using Moses, and God was completely flouting everybody around them of all the other cultures, Egypt and all the others, and saying, this is the truth. We don't need the other cultures around in order to understand Genesis. Now, notice this, that in Isaiah chapter 40, verse 22, and this isn't the only reference, he talks about stretching the heavens, the Shemayim, as a curtain. Now this gets exceedingly interesting because it's not the only reference to God stretching the heavens. Let me just come to where it speaks about other matters to do with stretching. I'm not going to be able to deal with everything in my talk. If you want the notes, I'm going to send them to Chelsea or to James, and he can distribute them how you want. And that will include the slides that I've missed out. I want you to see that Isaiah 42 verse 5 says, "Thus says the Lord God, he that created the heavens and stretched them out." Isaiah 45 verse 12, "I've made the earth, created man upon it. I, even my hands, have stretched out the heavens, and all their host have I commanded." God stretched the heavens. I mentioned Isaiah 40 verse 22. I've read that one already. Jeremiah chapter 10 verse 12. "He has made the earth by his power. He has established the world by his wisdom and has stretched out the heavens by his discretion." Now, if this was just once or twice, I'd say maybe it's still just, just a poetical license, and it's just sort of just talking about God's greatness and some sort of vague idea that God is big. But because it's repeated, and it's actually 11 times in the Old Testament, many of us have come to the conclusion that God is actually making a very important point, that he really did stretch space and pushed it out. I suggest to you on day 4. Now do you begin to see how God just looks at the stars as nothing in his sight? He's well able to push them out if he wishes. Well, if he's pushing out space, it's hardly surprising we see redshift everywhere. Cosmological redshift is actually probably a product, I can't be utterly sure on this, but it's probably a product of the residual expansion still going on today of space. Now, I find that staggering. Now, I'm not denying relativity. In fact, I think there's a lot of observations, I haven't time to go into them, which actually strongly suggest that there is a relativity issue as well. In other words, I'll just summarize it. For those of you not familiar with relativity and Einstein, I'm not saying I've immersed my whole career in it, but I do understand what he's saying, that process time itself is affected by local mass. If there is strong gravitation in some areas, then process time goes slower than it does where there is very little mass. Now, if you've got a lot of mass in the beginning concentrated, right? And I remember I said that God would have made space finite, but today huge, right? Well, you can imagine that as he pushes it out, you've got all sorts of process time issues to do with relativity, which I haven't time in this short talk, you might not think it's short, to actually get into, right? But now, look, get this. Look at all these other verses. Jeremiah 51, verse 15. Job 9, verse 8. Psalm 104, verse 2. Isaiah 44, verse 24. Zechariah 12, verse 1. That almost, not quite, but almost the last book in the Old Testament. And he's still saying the Lord stretches forth the heavens. Here, guys, when Jesus Christ was dying on the cross, it says in Hebrews 1 verse 3 that he supports all things by the word of his power. Our Saviour is the Creator. John 1 tells us that. Without him was not anything made that was made. John 1 verse 3. That means that even on the cross, our blessed Saviour was supporting Andromeda and all the other galaxies and all the expanse of the universe. That was nothing to him to still be doing that. And yet he was in the process of dying for my sin. The mind gets completely blown when you see what Scripture is saying. That the second person of the Trinity on the cross is greater than anything put against him. Because he was at the same time supporting the whole universe by the word of his power and dying for my sins and supporting the breath of all those who were persecuting him and supporting the breath of those who were dying either side of him and speaking to the one who called on him and said, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Wow, what a savior we have. Do you get it? Now do you see that when you approach things biblically, the science begins to become apparent and the greatness of Christ begins to become apparent. Now, I need to tell you about the end just in the last few minutes. How's it going to end, guys? This gives you the clue. The universe will be folded up like a scroll. Or in another place, it talks about like a curtain. Now do you begin to get it from... If you look at the universe from God's point of view, you get the clues as to how to understand the stars. I haven't got the full answer to the light travel problem. I've suggested various routes of thought in the book which I wrote with Stuart Burgess, which some of you have got, right? I'm not absolutely hand on heart saying that that is the answer. I've mentioned relativity being possibly relevant to this as well. But what I'm trying to get at is what's underneath this, which is that there is a finite universe and that God is going to roll it up like a scroll. In other words, from God's point of view, what we see is 3 dimensions. He sees rather like a scroll, right? I'm using a parallel. He's in another dimension. He can see the end from the beginning, right? He's not limited by space, is he? So he can just grab the whole of the 3 dimensions of space and regard them like we would regard 2 dimensions. And he can just roll it up, right? He says, that's my universe. I'll just roll it up now. Time to end it. Or like a rug. He could just, I won't do it, James, I assure you. But, he could just pull it. And the whole of the universe comes down in a moment. It says, in the twinkling of an eye, the Lord will come in 1 Corinthians 15. Now, do you see that when you see the greatness of God in the Scriptures as regards the stars, now you can begin to do your astronomy. Here it is where it mentions the heavens rolled together as a scroll. Psalm 102 talks about a vesture. I'm not wearing anything. It's so hot, I didn't put it on. But, he just sees it like a coat and he just rolls it up. Psalm 102. And that, of course, is quoted in Hebrews 1. The heavens and the earth are the works of your hands. They shall perish. You remain. But they all shall wax old as doth a garment. That's just the Old English. And as a vesture, as a coat, you will fold them up. And they shall be changed. Do you see this Hebrew? They shall be changed. It immediately rings again. It's quoting the Hebrew. This is the book of Hebrews. It's Greek here. But do you see that Paul's got the same in his mind when he says in 1 Corinthians 15, we shall be changed. You see, the whole God is using similar phrases to make you think. He's going to change it, not in millions of years, but in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye. Everything will be changed. Now you shine that back on Genesis 1. How long did it take for the Lord to put the stars there? No time at all. No time at all. Christians have been writing all sorts of stuff. I don't want to name names. It's not for my... I've mentioned John Walton because I really don't think he's right and he's led a lot of people astray. But I won't mention any more. Christians have been trying to marry the Big Bang ideas with the Christian position. You can't do it. Stand tall. Don't be duped by worldly philosophy. Paul writes that in Colossians 1, the very book that I read. Don't get taken in by Cambridge University Astronomy Department, Leeds University Astronomy Department, all the astronomy departments, which are locked into secular thinking and Big Bang ideology. You need to, number one, see that God made the stars, God made the galaxies, God made a finite universe. Now, that's a holy cow in secular thinking. The universe is infinite. It doesn't matter which way you look, it's always the same. No, it's not. No, it's not. It's not the same everywhere. It's not homogeneous. How come? I did have a slide on this here. I haven't got it. Oh, I thought I had it. Oh dear, it was here. I've lost it. But I have a slide. I'm going to have to put it in later. I think I must have missed it out. But how come that there is a redshift of galaxies? Here it is. How come that when people look, this is a very simplistic picture, but when you look at the galaxies, they seem to be in rings. You remember I mentioned the Great Wall of Galaxies? Remember I mentioned the local supercluster? Well, as you go further out, they seem to be in redshift rings round where we are. So I'm not talking about, geocentricity in any way. I'm just talking about this is the Milky Way. It's the local group. So as you go out beyond the local group, you actually find that galaxies seem to be in concentric rings. So it seems to be shells of other galaxies. This comes from a book, Quasars, Redshift and Controversies. So the evidence is consistent with a finite universe, with the Milky Way not far from the center. Virtually all the galaxies are redshifted from our point of view. There's only one or two which are blue shifted. Don't worry, they're not going to collide with us. Andromeda's one of them. Andromeda, which is a beautiful galaxy, you could see it almost with the naked eye. You get your big SLR on it, you can probably take a picture of it on a clear night. And Andromeda is a beautiful galaxy, but it's blue shifted and it's coming a little bit towards us. Don't worry, it's not coming directly towards us. Just that there is a closing speed, which is probably going to take, if we were here for millions of years, that sort of time to get to us. It's never going to. But it's slightly coming towards us. There's one or two other galaxies, but there's very few. Most of them are moving away from us. We are near the center. If you've got a center, you've got an edge. What did it say in day 2? The waters below, which is where we come from, the earth, and the waters above are at the edge of the whole finite universe. If you read Russ Humphreys, if you want to read more on this in the Answers in Genesis, Creation Ministries International Institute of Creation Research, look up his name, Russell Humphreys, Humphrys. He has suggested water on the edge of the universe. He's even made some interpretations as to why there was what we call a pioneer anomaly as this spacecraft that NASA sent out years ago began to go out of the solar system. It appeared to be going slightly different speed to what they expected. And he suggested that it was because there is a slight attraction from the mass of water way out there on the edge of the universe. A very interesting point he made. I don't know whether he can quite prove that conclusively, but I think the scriptures are definitely saying that there is water crystals way out there on the edge of the universe. So our universe, in conclusion, is made by God. It's finite, but it's not never-ending. We have a God who is never-ending. So let me come as I close to the cross, which I've already mentioned. When Christ died on the cross, amazingly, God put out the sun. That was supernatural. Wasn't an eclipse. He put out the sun for 3 hours. as Jesus Christ died on the cross. He controls the sun. Anybody worried here about climate change? God's in control. God controlled the sun then. He controls it now. I think actually, if you do want a scientific analysis of climate change, you have to look up my talk on YouTube, which is there on climate change. I think there are variations in the sun going on, which go in not just in 11 years, but go into 300 years. There are cycles which the scientists are not properly taking account of because it's not politically helpful to them, to their position. For the preaching of the cross is to them that perish foolishness, but unto us which are saved it is the power of God. The foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. When Jesus Christ died on that cross, he was dying for our sins. How are we saved? By humbling ourselves before the mighty hand of God and receiving his salvation, where he purchased our salvation and took the guilt in my place that I might be saved. How are you going to understand the stars? With humility. One of the big problems with the secular view of the stars is a lack of humility. They make massive assumptions and never tell you that they've made them. They're just trying to race things into publication that they might get the credit. But actually, some of them, as I showed you, are absolutely foxed as to why. You know, we go further out, we've got more and more mature galaxies. It's because God put them there on day 4 and pushed them out there. That's my conviction. And that's what's been indicated. When you put the scriptures into your thinking, you get a totally different view of cosmology. Thank you for listening to me. May God bless you all. Thank you. If you're not a Christian, I've written a booklet, Are You Really an Atheist? Which I've been using on the open air. Most of you here I know are Christians, but there may be one or two who aren't. And you quietly want to grab me afterwards as you're tucking into a lemon meringue, whatever, that I saw earlier. But we're having a lunch together, so just grab me and I'll put my lemon meringue to one side and I'll talk to you.